Hey there. If you're lying down with your eyes starting to get heavy, this might just be the perfect little journey to drift off to. Though, fair warning, it gets a little dark. Tonight, we're heading back to a time people love to romanticize. Knights, castles, chivalry. Yeah, forget all that. The Middle Ages were rough, and one of the most brutal, lonely, and downright cursed jobs back then, being an executioner. Sounds powerful, right? But in reality, these folks lived like ghosts, feared, shunned, and treated like they were cursed. Every swing of the axe didn't just carry weight. It carried spiritual dread. Tonight's slow, quiet tale will walk through those hidden corners of medieval life. From executioners to plague watchers, body collectors, and other jobs that sound normal. Until you really look. If stories like this help you unwind, or if you just like seeing history in a more honest light, feel free to like or subscribe. Only if you really want to. Where are you listening from? And hey, what time is it where you are? Now, dim the lights, pull the blanket a little closer, and let these old, forgotten voices lull you to sleep. You think being an executioner meant power? Respect? A cold, stoic man in black with the crowd's gaze fixed on every move? Think again. You were born with blood already on your name, and not the kind that washes off. In medieval Europe, the title of executioner wasn't earned. It was inherited. It was inherited, like a cursed family heirloom, passed down from father to son, generation to generation. Your last name alone could seal your fate before you even spoke your first word. No one asked what you wanted to be when you grew up. No one asked what you dreamed about at night. They already knew you were born to kill. Even as a child, you could feel the stain. You hadn't laid a finger on anyone, but still, the baker's wife refused to sell your mother bread. Not unless she paid double and kept her distance. The priest would lower his eyes when you entered the square, not in shame, but in subtle contempt. The other children? They didn't laugh with you. They laughed at you. Some wouldn't even touch the toys you played with, as if guilt could transfer by skin. You were something different, something marked. And so began the paradox. Society needed you, but never wanted you. Every village, every town needed someone to wield the axe, to carry out the sentence. But God forbid you touched the bread before they did. They whispered about you. Said the devil must sleep in your house, that your soul had no shadow. You'd walk through the marketplace and people would scatter like rats before a storm. Even the beggars avoided your coin. Even the dogs growled. You lived outside the city gates, close to the gallows. Your home wasn't a home. It was a boundary. A place where no one knocked, unless it was to drop a corpse at your door. A place where the wind carried the smell of rotting justice, and where crows didn't fly. They nested. That was your lullaby. That, and your father sharpening the blade long after midnight. Because make no mistake, your father was the executioner. And so you would be too. The only education you received came from his blood-stained hands. He taught you anatomy not from books, but from bodies. How to dislocate a spine cleanly. How to break bone without breaking the skin. And most importantly, how to do it quickly, efficiently. A botched execution wasn't just messy. It was humiliating. You weren't judged by your morals, but by your precision. Every public execution was a performance. The town gathered not for justice, but for entertainment. They wanted a clean cut, a swift drop, a bit of blood in the sand, but not too much. They wanted drama, not disaster. If your blade faltered, if the condemned cried too long or thrashed too much, you didn't just ruin a death, you ruined your name. And that was the only thing you had. So you learned to perform. You stood tall, masked not just by cloth, but by silence. Never speak, never tremble. Kill and leave. No one taught you how to sleep afterward. No one taught you how to forget the look in a mother's eyes before you swung. They only taught you how to aim for the spine. But in the shadows of that mask, you were still human. Weren't you? You asked once. To your mother, On a night when the wind howled too loudly and the stench outside was too strong. Whether she thought God could forgive you, she didn't answer. Just turned away, her face swallowed by the flickering candlelight. That was your first lesson in silence. And there would be more. You'll learn that money doesn't buy peace. That even silver earned from justice smells different. Metallic, yes, but also cursed. No matter how high your salary, the butcher won't take your coin. That your hands are always considered dirty, no matter how many times you wash them. That your job is always necessary, but never noble. And you'll learn that death follows you not just in duty, but in dreams. So now, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from? And what time is it for you? Is it night yet? This is a confession. And it begins not with a crime, but with a child. A child born to the most invisible, unforgettable job in the world. The one who holds the axe, but never the power. You step onto the world's most morbid stage, not as a performer, not as a man, but as a role inherited like a scar. You are the son of the executioner. You are the son of the executioner. Your name may differ by tongue or region, but in every town, it carries the same bitter taste. You are not you. You are what they whisper. His son, that boy, him. Even your shadow feels like it was cast by someone else past. The man who taught you everything you know. The swing, the aim, the breath to take right before the drop, was your father. But he wasn't just a father. He was a fortress. Silent, stone-faced, with eyes like chipped slate. He didn't speak unless he had to. He didn't comfort. He instructed. You didn't sit on his lap for stories. You stood beside him, watching as he scrubbed blood from wood with salt and sand, muttering to himself about angles and leverage. You learned early that his love wasn't soft, and his lessons weren't kind. They were necessary. He wore the job like a second skin, and he was teaching you to do the same. Your mother was a ghost long before she died. Not dead, but vanished from the eyes of the town. They looked through her, past her, around her. No one knocked at your door, not even when her face turned sallow, her hands trembling too much to cook. When she passed, there was no funeral, just a shallow hole and silence. Even the priest declined to speak over her body. He said the church couldn't bless someone unclean. That night, your father didn't cry. He just walked out and sat near the gallows, bottle in hand, sharpening a blade that didn't need sharpening. You didn't ask what he was thinking. You never did, but somehow you knew. Then there's the town, your permanent audience and cruelest critic. You learned to read their eyes before their words. They watched you not like you were one of them, but like you were something they fed on to feel safe. You weren't a boy to them. You were a warning, a walking reminder that justice always had a face, and it looked just like yours. And the other children? They played knights and dragons. You were never the knight, always the monster. If they let you join, it was only to play the one who died. Or worse, the one who did the killing. You became fluent in shame before you knew how to write your name. But still you had one companion, silence. It wrapped around you like a blanket. It filled the house, the fields beyond the city wall, the small room where your family slept. You learned to move quietly, to listen without speaking. You became so used to being avoided that you stopped trying to be seen. Yet amid all that, you knew who you were meant to become. The path was already carved. Your hands would grow into his gloves. Your steps would echo down the same dirt path to the gallows. You would inherit the axe, not out of honor, but because no one else wanted it. The only ally you had was steel, cold, dependable, honest in its cruelty. It never lied, never flinched. It did exactly what you asked. So long as your hands were steady and your heart stayed quiet. And that steadiness, that silence, It's what would keep you alive. Because in this story, you don't get friends. You don't get mentors. You get reputation. You get watched. And above all, you get the performance. A stage made of dirt and blood. A crowd hungry for a clean cut. And your name barely spoken, but always remembered. Just long enough to be feared. From the very start, your world was smaller than most. Not by size, but by possibility. You grew up in the shadow of the gallows, in a home built not for comfort, but for function. Stone floors, wooden beams stained from winters long before you were born. Your playthings were not dolls or wooden swords, but old tools handed down like cursed relics. You learned to clean the block before you could spell your own name, and you were made to watch, again and again, as your father's axe dropped with mechanical precision. No screams, no hesitation, just silence before the thought. That silence was louder than any scream could ever be. There was no bedtime story in your house, only instructions. Stand firm. Don't look them in the eyes. Don't flinch. Your training was both method and madness. You practiced on logs at first, then pigs, then deer. Each day you were told where to cut, how to feel the tension in the neck, how to angle your strike to avoid bone. Your father spoke little, but when he did, his voice was like iron. Cold, unmoving, final. You wanted to ask why. Why this life? Why this fate? But questions were dangerous. You learned to bury them, alongside your hope. The first time you stood beside him during a real execution, you were barely tall enough to see over the crowd. They were all there. Townsfolk, merchants, nobles passing through. Their faces bright with hunger, not for food but for spectacle. The condemned was a thief, caught with bread and blamed for more. Your father raised his axe. In a moment that stretched longer than any you'd ever known, it came down. The head didn't roll. It slumped. The crowd gasped, then cheered, and just like that, it was done. Justice, they called it. But all you saw was death. Years passed. You became him. The boy became the blade. You took your father's place when his hands grew slow, and when he died, they barely noticed. No burial in town, no eulogy, just a small mound outside the walls, marked with a stone and the sound of dirt covering flesh. You didn't cry. You couldn't. Not there. Not then. You were already the executioner now. You tried to live with dignity, but the world refused to let you forget who you were. You were never invited to the festivals. The butcher would leave your meat wrapped and hanging by the side door, as if touching your hand would make his knives dull. Children whispered ghost stories about you. Adults gave you a wide berth like your breath carried plague. Love? You tried once. She was the daughter of a gravedigger. You thought maybe she, too, understood what it meant to live on the edge of the village, in the shadows of grief. But when her family found out, she vanished. No note, no goodbye, just empty space where warmth used to be. You started drinking more, not to forget, but to dull the sharpness of remembering. Each night you returned to that silence, that stage. Each morning you awoke with the taste of ash in your mouth, the weight of dreams you couldn't shake. Sometimes they screamed. Sometimes they forgave you. The worst nights were when they said nothing at all. Then came the girl, accused of witchcraft, though no one could say why. She was barely 16. Her crime? A neighbor's cow fell sick. That was enough. You saw her face, more child than woman. Her eyes weren't scared. They were calm. Too calm, like she'd already died before she climbed the scaffold. The priest spit scripture. The crowd threw stones, but you hesitated. For the first time in years, your grip trembled. You wanted to scream, to say this was wrong, but you couldn't. You were the blade, not the judge, and so you did it. One clean strike. The crowd cheered. And you died too. though you were still breathing. After that, you changed. Not on the outside, you remained the same stoic mask. But inside, the questions returned. They clawed. They bit. They whispered in the corners of your thoughts during meals, during dreams. Was she innocent? How many others were? Was this really justice, or just theater? You started keeping a list. Not of names, but of eyes. The ones that looked at you with terror. The ones that looked away. And worst of all, the ones that looked grateful. That last look, it haunted you. Because maybe for them, death was mercy. Maybe you were the only one who noticed. Your body kept working, but your soul was somewhere else, detached. Like you were watching yourself perform a play night after night, and forgetting the lines. The crowd still came. Still cheered. Still wanted more. But you began to dread the applause more than the blood. One day, you missed. Not entirely, but enough. The man screamed. You had to strike again. The crowd turned, not angry, disappointed, disgusted. They didn't care who the man was. They cared that you ruined their show. The whispers started. Maybe he's getting old. Maybe the new apprentice should take over. You heard them. You knew what came next. The young man, your student, took your place weeks later. They didn't even tell you. Just handed him the axe. He smiled the way you used to. Unsure, eager, empty. And you stood behind the crowd, unseen, as he made the cut. Clean. Efficient. The cheers returned. And that was your cue to leave. No retirement. No thanks. No gold. Just silence. You returned to your home outside the walls. But it wasn't a home anymore. Just a room filled with ghosts. You stopped shaving, stopped counting the days. Your hands, once steady as stone, now shook when you tried to lift a spoon. You watched the world move on without you. Once, a boy threw a rock at your door and called you a monster. You didn't yell. You didn't cry. You just sat down and wondered if maybe he was right. Because in the end, all your life had been a performance. Well, no one applauded. Well, no one remembered. Just a blood-stained stage. There was no announcement, no farewell. Just a quiet shifting of the blade into younger hands. And you were left standing in the cold, watching your replacement from behind a crowd that no longer recognized your face. The town didn't hold ceremonies for executioners. Not when they arrived, and certainly not when they disappeared. You didn't expect gratitude, but still, a part of you had foolishly hoped someone would notice the weight you had carried for so long. Instead, they turned the page before you even stepped off stage. You weren't fired. That would have implied it. You were simply no longer called. No knock at your door at dawn. No letters, no coins in your box. One day you were a necessity. The next, you were an old man with shaking hands and memories no one wanted to share. It didn't happen all at once, but the silence grew thicker, heavier. The people who once avoided you with fear now passed by with indifference. Some even pitied you. An insult worse than hatred. A child you didn't recognize once threw a pebble at your window and shouted, "Monster!" before running off laughing. Not in terror, not in warning, but as a game. You weren't even scary anymore. So you stayed inside. You sat near the hearth, where the fire burned low and the dust gathered in corners like quiet judgment. The axe still hung on the wall, though no one had touched it in months. You could feel the wood handle calling to you in the night, whispering that your hands still remembered the weight, the balance. But you didn't answer. You didn't trust your grip. Not anymore. And your dreams, they changed. No longer just faces and cries and blood, but places. Halls you'd never walked. Graves you never dug. You saw your father again, younger, sharpening his blade by moonlight, his mouth moving in a prayer you never heard in waking life. You saw the girl, the one they said was a witch. She didn't scream in your dreams. She sang, a soft lullaby, barely audible over the wind. It was beautiful, and that made it worse. You stopped going into town altogether. The roads felt longer. The sky seemed lower. You once walked with purpose, shoulders square, steps measured. Now, even the birds didn't scatter when you passed. They just watched, like they knew your role had ended. And the boy, your apprentice, he didn't visit. He didn't need to. He had his own path now, one that looked so much like yours had. You almost pitied him. Almost. Because a part of you envied him too. Not for the role, but for still being necessary. Still being seen. There was a moment, not long after your last execution, when someone knocked on your door. Your heart jumped. Hope is cruel like that. It was a merchant, lost in the fog, asking for directions. When you opened the door, he stepped back. His eyes flickered to the axe, to your face, and then recognition. "I thought you were dead," he said. You didn't reply, just pointed the way and closed the door. You thought about leaving, walking away from the village, from the name, from the history carved into your skin. But where would you go? What does a man do when his only skill is one the world pretends not to need? You weren't a farmer. You weren't a tradesman. You were the final chapter in other people's stories. And now, yours had no more pages. You began to rot from the inside, not in body but in spirit. Your memories soured. The coin you'd saved, coin stained with the breath of dying men, sat untouched in a wooden chest. You had no one to leave it to. No one would take it anyway. People whispered about blood money like it carried disease. Even your name had started to vanish. Children didn't know it. Adults avoided it. The town records would likely skip you, a blank line between one executioner and the next. Just a brief mention, maybe, in a ledger. Replaced due to infirmity. You'd lived outside the city walls your whole life, and now, in death, you would lie there too, not buried in hallowed ground, not beneath a marker, just a hole near the same field where so many had breathed their last because of you. But you didn't fear death. You'd seen it up close, breathed it in, worn its scent like a second skin. What scared you wasn't the end. It was the quiet, the knowing that no one would speak your name, that your final breath would pass into air unmarked, unmissed. That after everything, after the years, the blood, the silence, the price you paid for being necessary, you were in the end disposable. A tool set down, a mask removed, a man forgotten. The day you died, it rained. Not a violent storm, just a steady, reluctant drizzle that soaked the soil until it drank your name away. No bells rang, no prayers. Just the sound of wet earth accepting one more unmarked body. They didn't bury you inside the village walls. They couldn't. Even in death, you were still too much for them. Too close to the thing they feared but needed. Too real. A ditch outside the southern gate. Shallow, quick, practical. No mark, no stone. Just a worn cloth bundle of bones and silence. And when the sun came out the next morning, the town moved on as if you'd never held the weight of their justice on your shoulders. No mention. No memory. Just a vacancy filled by another masked man. Younger. Steadier. Cleaner. The show, as always, continued. But what a strange play it had been. You were cast in the role of villain and savior all at once. A butcher for the righteous, a servant of law, banned from grace. And when the curtain fell, there was no applause. Just emptiness. Your entire life had been a contradiction. The kind people pretended not to see, because it made their world easier to live in. They called you necessary, but never invited. Paid you well, but would not touch your coin. Trusted your blade, but flinched at your breath. They never saw you. Not really. And perhaps that's the most damning truth. No matter how precisely you worked, no matter how silently you suffered, your legacy was meant to vanish. You were not remembered as a man. You were remembered as a function. A presence. A threat whispered to misbehaving children. They didn't hate you for what you did. They hated you for what you reminded them of. That every society needs someone to do the bloody work. But no one wants to see the blood on their own hands. You didn't bring injustice. You didn't make the laws. But you became their face, their steel edge, their closing act. And as time wore on, you began to see the cracks in it all. The thief hanged for stealing bread. The girl burned for looking too long at the stars. The beggar crushed by politics dressed as judgment. You saw it, but you couldn't speak. Your mouth was bound by the very blade you carried. And so you became complicit, not because you agreed, but because silence was survival. And silence eventually becomes who you are. You once asked yourself if there was redemption for people like you. If a man who'd carried out death, even unwillingly, could still be good. But you stopped asking. Because no one answered. Not the priest who turned his back. Not the God who never looked your way. And certainly not the people who turned justice into theater and your life into a sideshow. No one wanted to acknowledge. There's a terrible kind of peace in being forgotten. No expectations. No accusations. Just dust and distance. But even in that silence, you wondered, what was the point? Was your suffering the price of someone else's comfort? Was your loneliness the scaffold that held up their illusion of law? And if so, was that justice? Or just cruelty dressed up in robes? Maybe your life was never about justice at all. Maybe it was about containment, keeping people from seeing the full ugliness of the system they lived in. You were the wall between them and their sins. The executioner, the exile, the human trash bin for all their guilt. And when your hands could no longer lift the axe, and your body could no longer perform, they threw you away like old wood. Not because you had changed, but because they didn't need the illusion anymore. Your story, like your body, was buried in dirt. No inscription, no memory, no legacy. But maybe that, too, is its own lesson. That even the most necessary people can be discarded. That society often survives not by honoring its servants, but by forgetting them. And that sometimes the ones who carry the heaviest burdens leave the quietest echoes. So let that be the final whisper in this long, sleepless tale. Not every villain was a monster. Not every silence was consent. And not every grave stays empty. Because somewhere out there, a boy sharpens a blade. His father watches in silence. And the stage, forever stained and waiting, has never truly closed its curtain. Justice, after all, always needs a face, even if it's a forgotten one.